Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Smithsonian American Art Museum for the Renwick Gallery's Symposium Furniture in the Future, which we are co-sponsoring with the Sam and Alfreda Maloof Foundation for the Arts and Crafts this morning. We're delighted to have you all here. We have a very full schedule today and some really fantastic speakers on the docket. Really looking forward to the day. And in a moment, I'm going to introduce Jim Rawich, who is my co-sponsor for the morning. But Jim was telling me last night, it's been a couple of years. This program has been long in coming. It actually was sort of birthed in idea before I arrived at the museum 2.5 years ago. And we really just started to work on it about a year ago. And as Jim and I were starting to talk about some of the ideas that we had for this symposium, we really wanted to think a little outside the box of the usual furniture symposium. We wanted to put together a lineup of speakers that could really be provocative and talk about furniture and what it is and what it can be today and what it can be tomorrow. I think I had been thinking quite a bit about how ubiquitous furniture is in our lives, that we live with it every day and it's all around us and it affects every single aspect of who we are and what we do, but we often don't acknowledge that. And so we wanted to bring some speakers together here today to really explore some of those ideas and think about how furniture makers in particular and designers can affect the world around them today and for the future. So today we'll talk about what furniture can be, how it can define us in the world around us, and how we can begin to think about it and harness it not only as a reflection of society, but as an agent of change. We'll talk about the history of the field and how furniture design and making is being taught and practiced today in craft schools across the country. And we'll open up the floor to talk about how the field is responding to contemporary issues, methods, and needs, and how we foresee those issues, methods, and needs changing over the next 10, 20, 50 years. We have a fabulous roster of speakers, which will be approaching these topics from all different angles. This is a full-day symposium. It will last until about 5:30 this afternoon, after which we'll have a small reception, and you can have longer conversations with the speakers at that time if you like. The day is broken up into 2 segments, a morning section and an afternoon section. And so if you can all hold your questions until the end of the section, we will be bringing up all the speakers from that section to address those questions at the end of the morning and then again at the end of the afternoon. Those will be also, there are a couple of microphones at either side of the room, so we'll have those set up for all of you to come ask the questions you have on your mind. I hope there are a lot of provocative ideas that come up that get you talking. This program this morning will be webcast, so please don't do anything embarrassing in the audience that you don't want everyone to see across the country and on our YouTube channel from here on out. And please silence your cell phones for the morning. And I also just wanted to add as one last note, we just opened a fantastic exhibition over at the Renwick Gallery. I know we're not in the building itself today for this program, but I'd like to invite all of you to come over to the Renwick Gallery and see the new show, the 2016 Renwick Invitational Visions and Revisions, which just opened. The whole museum is all on view right now. It looks absolutely fabulous. And with that, I'd like to invite Jim Rawich from Sam and Alfreda Maloof Foundation up here to give some more remarks for the morning.
Thank you, Nora.
Thank you, Jim.
I'm not going to talk long, but I am delighted to be here. Oh.
Let me switch for you.
So as Nora gave you a little bit of the background, I can add to that a bit. When we started making plans for the Maloof Centennial, we wanted to make sure that our celebration of Sam's life wouldn't end without looking forward. Sam's career was so much defined by his innovative, creative spirit. We're delighted that today's symposium gives us an opportunity to look to the future with the help of an impressive list of distinguished scholars and artists. I don't know how many of you may know this, some of you probably do, but since 1970, the Smithsonian American Art Museum's Renwick Gallery has spotlighted Sam's works in no fewer than 5 exhibitions. The Maloof Foundation is also a Smithsonian affiliate, and we're grateful for that membership and the energy that that brings. Before we go any further, I'd like to thank all the folks at the Smithsonian who have been supportive of this program today, and really just incredible in enabling us to achieve this dream for the Maloof Centennial. In alphabetical order, Rachel Allen, Nora Atkinson, of course, Elizabeth Brune, Harold Kloster of Smithsonian Affiliates, Robin Kennedy, and all the Smithsonian staff that has helped to make today possible. Special thanks are also due to Nicholas Bell, who is no longer at the Smithsonian, but whose presence in the planning and the realization of this idea was an important part of our story. I also want to thank the board of the Maloof Foundation, with a special call out this morning to Mrs. Sam Maloof, Sam's widow Beverly, who is here, and other board members as well. You get a chance to meet them at the break. Last and certainly not least, I want to acknowledge our generous supporters and funders, the James Renwick Alliance, so important to the Renwick Gallery, the Wingate Foundation, whose support for the Maloof Centennial and the larger American craft community is tremendous and transformational, and Woodcraft Supply, a Maloof Foundation corporate partner that, with more than 70 stores nationwide, connects America's woodworkers to the tools and supplies that they need to forward the story of wood in the United States. To set the stage for today's presentations, I'd like to show you a few photos. That's Sam Maloof, born in California, son of Middle Eastern immigrants. He was artistic in school, tried commercial art, he tried painting, he turned down an offer from the Disney animation studios. Then he joined the Army a week before Pearl Harbor and found himself serving World War II in Alaska, and then he returned to California. Sam married well. That's Alfreda Ward. Alfreda graduated in art at UCLA and taught art on Indian reservations during the Depression in the 40s. As a veteran, she used the GI Bill to study art in grad school at Claremont Graduate University, and that was where she met Sam. Now, unlike Sam, Alfreda was formally trained in art and brought that enthusiasm into their lives together. They had a family. Wait a minute, we're not moving here. There's Sam and Alfreda. It's a great picture. They had a family. That's their son, Slyman. And as a result of starting a family and dealing with the realities of earning a living and keeping food on the table, they started a business together, Sam and Alfreda both. It was a woodworking business, and Sam was self-taught as a woodworker. He was meticulous, hardworking. He was a craftsman who brought his vision and values to furniture making, and he was also part of a larger story, too. In the early 1950s, studio craft was on the threshold of a new age, and Sam became a visible and charismatic advocate and teacher. And this movement was happening not just in California. The crafts movement was happening all across America. And in fact, Haystack Mountain School of Craft was founded about the same time. And today's Paul Sakaridis is one of today's presenters. Paul is at the Haystack School, and we're lucky to have him here on the panel today. Sam's furniture was not manufactured. He sculpted. He sculpted beautiful handmade pieces one at a time. And this idea of furniture as sculpture is something we'll hear more about later with Wendell Castle, who's on our artist panel today. And that panel is going to be moderated by Glenn Adamson, who will be able to offer some additional perspective on the art of furniture making. That is a very rare picture. That's a picture of Sam in a coat and a tie. You don't get to see that often. The real reason it's in there is it gives you a sense of his simple, sensual, elegant, modernist aesthetic. Our keynote speaker, Michael Prokopow, knows the period well and its influence on contemporary furniture, and he'll be talking to some of those subjects. And I love this picture. It shows what hip and fashionable looked like in 1958. That's Sam Maloof there, but there are some other folks in the photo, and I think it gives us a good point of reference for today and the folks who are going to be talking about furniture today, contemporary furniture, and how it leads to the future. I think the photo also speaks to how the world has changed, or not so much. I mean, you see all those designers, a number of them worked in partnership with each other, and I think Uhuru's Bill Hilgendorf and Jason Horvath would fit right into that photo. I think the photo also reminds us how much things have changed for women as furniture makers, and we thank Wendy Maruyama, Vivian Beer, Christy Oates, and many other women woodworkers and furniture makers for that. We're lucky to have those three with us on our artist panel today, and I think that 1958 looks like a long way away when you think about how the world has changed for women. In spite of what you see here, Sam never licensed his designs for mass production. In a 60-year career, he made more than 5,000 pieces of furniture, many of which reside in the collections of America's major fine art museums. Maloof Foundation resident artist Larry White was there for much of that time, and he is here today with us on the artist panel to add another perspective. Well, when Sam wasn't making furniture, he was building his home in Alta Loma, California, now a part of Rancho Cucamonga, the city of Rancho Cucamonga. As the house evolved, it came to be recognized as a cultural treasure. It was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It was located in what became the path of an interstate highway project, and it might have been doomed. But a team of preservationists, planners, architects, and engineers worked collaboratively to save the house. It was taken apart, put on wheels, and moved to a new site about 3 miles away. It was an amazing feat of engineering, and equally significant, it's a great example of collaborative planning in historic preservation projects. The house was reconstructed here on a hill in the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains overlooking Southern California's Inland Empire. Today, the historic home and workshop stand in a drought-tolerant model garden accompanied by an education center, a gallery, a conservation archive, and I tell everybody I get to work in paradise. Come and see us sometime. The Maloof Woodworker Enterprise still occupies its original workshop space, where master woodworker Mike Johnson worked alongside Sam for more than 3 decades and now carries on the business. I love this picture, and it's relevant to today because you look at that workshop and you don't see any 3D printers or NC cutting machines, and I think when we look to the future of furniture, we have some things to think about. The Maloof Foundation pursues its public service mission with public tours and educational programs. That's Mike Johnson there in the middle, leading some students on a tour. Mike is here today. We also offer wood shops, workshops for woodworkers. Larry White in that picture is now the resident artist of the Maloof Foundation, and he is on the, of course, on the artist panel. We do exhibitions emphasizing wood art and other fine crafts. That happens to be a photo of our Maloof Centennial exhibition, Sam Maloof Woodworker, Life, Art, Legacy, which just closed. A year ago, at this time, we were doing California Handmade State of the Arts in collaboration with Craft in America. And a month from now, we'll be doing California Wood Artists, featuring master artists alongside a new generation of artists. We do arts education, including our Maloof Teen Intern program in the local schools. I think that's our Getty Multicultural Intern Day. And we also do the Maloof Veterans Workshop, which explores woodworking and the healing of PTSD. This year's workshop exclusively serves women veterans. That is not the picture of the women veterans. That workshop hasn't taken place yet. And of course, in addition to all that, we do a range of public programs made possible thanks to staff, docents, volunteers, and supporters with grants from corporate and foundation partners. You can check us out online. And of course, whenever you're in the neighborhood, we'd be glad to see you visit. I offer up all that background as a way of setting the stage for today and our exploration of furniture in the future. What we make, why we make, and how it impacts our world. By the way, this photo was taken in 1985 when Sam became the first craft artist to receive a MacArthur Fellowship. People magazine printed that picture, and he's shown there with his low-back armchair that became an iconic piece of Maloof design. It also became part of the Renwick Gallery's permanent collection, and Nora has recently reinstalled selections from the permanent collection on the second floor of the Renwick Gallery. Be sure to stop by and see it while you're in Washington, D.C. You will see this chair alongside a Nakashima chair on the second floor. Sam was also famous for his rocking chairs, and we can't leave Washington, D.C. without mentioning a few of the folks who have, over the years, admired and enjoyed Sam's creations. Here's someone you might recognize. Oh no, I'm talking about Sam. Sam at the White House there with Alfreda and someone you might remember. The chair is now part of the White House collection. Here's somebody else you might recognize. Jimmy Carter calls Sam the best woodworker that ever lived. And that really means something, coming from a guy who is himself an accomplished woodworker. So I got to meet President Carter a while ago, and a wonderful experience. Here's a Nobel Prize winning former president and Sunday school teacher who considers Sam Maloof one of the most significant, important influences in his life. How do you measure impact like that? What made Sam significant? Is Sam's legacy that of a woodworker, that of a furniture maker, a sculptor? Jimmy Carter calls Sam Maloof a philosopher. And I think that we can take all those things in consideration when we think about his place in the evolution of the story of American furniture and how that story now goes forward. And that's one of the things we want to think about today as we hear from our scholars and our presenters. Here's someone else you might recognize. Yes, that's who you think it is. I think she's recovering from pneumonia there in that picture. That was actually taken a while ago. That's not a recent picture. Before I turn the stage over to our distinguished presenters, there's one more Maloof fan I want to mention, someone you probably won't recognize. That is our good friend Kay Langen of Greenwich, Connecticut. In 1959, Kay asked Alfreda Maloof if Sam had ever made a rocking chair. Alfreda confessed that going back to her days as a young mother, she had always wanted Sam to build a rocking chair, and he never had. Well, in 1963, Kay and her late husband, Dr. Michael Langen, commissioned Sam to make a rocking chair, the first Maloof rocking chair, and the rest, as they say, is history. For 53 years, Sam Maloof's first rocking chair has been in the Langen family home, where it has rocked children, babies, and grandchildren, and been a comfort to both Kay and Michael. Michael passed away a year or so ago, but Kay is as joyful and passionate about craft as ever, as you can see from that photo. Although Kay is in her 90s and isn't able to travel much anymore, I understand she's at home this morning watching our webcast. and she agreed to let me share some news today. Kay has recently bequeathed the Langan family's treasured Maloof rocking chair, the very first one ever made, when she's done with it, to the Sam and Alfreda Maloof Foundation, where it will become part of our permanent collection. And here with us today to celebrate is one of Kay's and Michael's 7 children. Their daughter, Meg Langan Moore. Is Meg here? Meg? She's going to be here later today, I know. Thank you all for being with us. Thank you all for sharing the day with us. Thank you, Langan family, for this wonderful gift. And let's get on with the day. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jim, for starting us off. I'd now like to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, Dr. Michael Prokopow. Michael is a historian, critic, and curator who writes about material culture, art, and aesthetics, and the built environment. And I asked him here this morning to set the stage for our day to deliver a more philosophical, ontological approach to where we are and where we're going. So I'm delighted when he delivered his provocative title to me, Cabinets of Virtuosity, Neo-Kings Confounding Things in Hyper-Luxury in the Contemporary Frame. And I can't wait to hear what he has to say. He's the Dean of Graduate Studies at OCAD University, where, among other things, he teaches material culture, contemporary art history, curatorial practice, and design history. Currently, he's working on a large-scale project about middle-class taste in North America between 1940 and 1975, and a book about a landmark modernist house designed by renowned architect Arthur Erickson. He holds a doctorate from Harvard University. Please welcome Michael Prokopow to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. It's the old college professor trick where you bring a lot of things to the podium, so I need a second to get ready, but I will be quick. It is such a great pleasure to be here. I have long admired the work of the Renwick, long admired the work of Mr. Maloof, and so when the invitation came for me to speak at this esteemed gathering, I was thrilled and anxious. And I can explain why I was anxious, because in thinking about the brief for today, contemplating the future directions of furniture, I started to wonder, how does one tackle such a big topic? Before I get to that, I would like to thank a few people for the invitation. I'd like to louder, of course. Sorry about that. There we go. I would like to thank Ms. Nora Atkinson for her support. She's the Lloyd Herman Curator of Craft at the Renwick. I'd like to thank Ms. Gloria Kenyon, also of the Renwick, for her generous assistance and forgiveness. She knows this morning I actually went to the Renwick this morning thinking that's where we were meeting. And I got there and I thought, oh, sort of a quiet crowd. And then the guard said, no one's here. And then I thought, uh-oh. So then I managed to get here in time. So thank you for understanding. I'd like to thank Ms. Melanie Sweezy Cleaves of the Sam and Alfreda Maloof Foundation and the very nice remarks of Mr. Rawich. As I say, when I was invited to speak at this event, I was concerned intellectually and conceptually about the task. I confess this to you all because I spend a great deal of time thinking about furniture across the Western historical timeline, from the stone furniture of Skara Brae, which is in the Orkneys. I'll show you an image of that eventually, and through every art historical period where human beings have fashioned objects for use. I think about the guild systems, technological innovations, the trial and error of manufacturing, about the persistence of handmade objects in the wake of mass production and the commercialization and mechanization of making. I think about the context of furniture in time, about ideological movements such as modernism, which sought to achieve a type of realizable and tangible utopia for people. And I think about the wake of postmodernism, that period in time where the ideals of modernism were challenged. I think also about the contemporary frame. Historians have yet to come up with a label or a name for the present, and that, of course, will be resolved at some point in the future. There's always the advantage that historians have of hindsight. In thinking about today's conversation and the conversations that I know will be stimulating and rigorous and challenging, I started thinking about if we were tasked with writing a chapter in the standard history of furniture, a chapter about today. How would we undertake that challenge? First off, we'd have to figure out when the contemporary begins. Is it a year ago? Is it a decade ago? We'd have to figure out a position from what ideological or cultural or philosophical position would we start our work in thinking about contemporary furniture. We would have to certainly acknowledge the previous generations and iterations of furniture making in history in order to come up with a type of conceptual framework. To my mind, the fact of postmodern design, I think of the work of Memphis, I think of Peter Shire, I think of the anti-modernist movements that have marked challenges to modernist culture. So postmodernism as a frame might be the most recent chapter in our book. We certainly would have to think in this chapter about technological change, about 3D printing, about laser sintering, about advanced computer software that allow makers to think of objects in ways beyond what the human mind might be possible. There are any number of makers. Patrick Jouan in Paris made a really remarkable stool that collapsed, and he openly confesses that had it not been for a very advanced algorithm, he would not have been able to figure out the mechanics of his stool. Well, that to me raises questions about humans and technology, the idea of cyborgs and robotic people. A central theme certainly could be in this chapter the relations between makers and their clients, or producers and consumers. I offer this because what I would like to talk about, and I will talk about, is the question of where furniture resides not only in human life, how we as people, and Ms. Atkinson has acknowledged this, furniture surrounds us, we use it all the time, but it exists as commodity. It's in the transactional world. If we were thinking about a title, academics, I noticed that the title that was read is not the title on the screen, and that happens to me all the time. I'm constantly sort of thinking as an academic about the title, and there is that standard joke in professorial worlds, all you really need to do is write the title. But in fact, there's more to it. So I thought of a few titles that might be good for our sort of mythical chapter at the end of this textbook. What the heck? Family rooms, flat-screen TVs, home entertainment centers, and the transformation of social relations. Shock and awe, the persistence of the hand in making. Home sweet home, the IKEAization of the North American suburban domestic landscape. Get with the program, digital tools and technological determinism in contemporary furniture design. Or lastly, and perhaps most appropriate, mortis rigor, craftsmanship, consumers, and the critical meanings of contemporary making. As I say, indeed, the last title may be the most appropriate. I know that designers in today's landscape are working at all scales of production, using all means of making, hands, computers. And yet the objects that are produced exist as evidence of the cultural, ideological, and social thinking of the milieu in which people work. We may live with furniture, we may buy furniture. For me as a historian, each object that any human has ever produced constitutes a piece of evidence about the context of its realization. As such, we can read furniture. We can look at every object, every human-made, every human-modified object, and undertake an analysis of time, of people, of values. The concept of what's called homo faber, meaning man the maker, it turns to the idea that humans from ancient history have sought to create tools that aid life. There is that adage that necessity is the mother of invention, and arguably human beings have always found a capacity to produce things that make things better or aid them in tasks. That said, we know that objects, once produced, have to reside or exist within social systems of meaning, or what we can call signification. I spent a lot of time reading home decorating magazines from the 1950s and the self-help guides that were pitched to newly married couples. These are highly gendered texts, but invariably there'll be a section at the beginning saying, "Hello, bride, what do you want your home to be? You have choices. You could go French provincial, and this is what that means. You could go colonial Williamsburg, and this is what this will say about you as a person. You could go modern." And there's always sort of the implication that that's a little daring, perhaps, for the cul-de-sac, But if you're progressive and you want to make the claim, go for it. So we have, in the material world, a relationship between the things that humans make and use and the meanings that are ascribed upon them, and which we, as scholars of the past, people interested in symbolism and interpretation, can take away from them. Human objects are vitally important in human life, and furniture as a category within that broad range of human-made and human-modified objects is perhaps the one that most literally embodies what might be called the prosthetic imperative, namely the fashioning of implements and devices, techne would be the word we would use around the making, that accommodate both physical and psychological needs. The fact of human problem solving through the fabrication of tools might be seen as obvious, but as far as I'm concerned in my work, the most remarkable and wonderful challenge is to figure out how, in addition to what a thing does, what a thing means. Accordingly, in thinking about furniture design, contemporary and otherwise, I'm struck by two things. First, as I said, the field is huge. The German publisher Konemann released a volume last year that acknowledged, on average, there are 15,000 new pieces of furniture produced in the West each year. Now, that may raise the question, jokingly asked, do we need another chair? We know the answer is yes, because human creativity is one of the most remarkable things that we as a shared people have, and yet there is, within the context of the impulse to make, the reality of how the made thing gets distributed, which brings us to capitalism. And arguably at this point in human time, with concerns about ecological catastrophe and the depletion of resources, the question of production or overproduction married to consumption or overconsumption is, I think, a cause for a concern. To this end, I was most welcoming of the instructions from the Renwick quote to consider how furniture is transforming to meet the needs of contemporary society, mindful of, quote, the broader implications of why we make, what we make, and how it affects our world. In responding to that very welcome invitation, I've decided in my talk to look at a very narrow scope of design. I'm looking at what I see as the production of objects that exist within the realm of the hyper-luxury consumer market. Now, it may be that most of us would not count ourselves amongst the 1%. I could barely get into the 70%. But if you think about it, there is within the realm of creativity and making an echelon of makers of immense skill and immense vision and immense capacity who have decided in the context of their practice to produce rarefied objects for the consumption by people who can afford it. This, I think, raises an interesting question. If we were to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art or to the National Gallery, we would see in the furniture galleries objects of exquisite rarity, the best of the best, things made by the most gifted craftsmen of their generations and chosen by curators because they exemplify, because they say something about the circumstances of their production. If we take that model and apply it to the contemporary field in the context of elite luxury making, I think we can discover important things about where we as a planet sit at the present. Terry Smith, a very eminent art historian, writes about the contemporary field in the context of art. And he has given us a phrase that's called, or word, contemporaneity. Sounds like contemporary, but it's not. It has a little inflection to it. And Professor Smith, in coining this phrase, contemporaneity, would say that the current conditions of today are specific to the circumstances of today. Now, it might be said that every moment in time experienced in real time could be described the same way. Professor Smith would argue that there's something about the forces of global economic development and resource extraction and wealth and the movements of people and the fragility of democracies, the idea of the post-national world, that contemporaneity is a state of urgent cultural productions. He gives three definitions. I'll paraphrase quickly. One, globalization drives hegemony in the face of increasing cultural differentiation. We live in a planet of diverse cultures, and yet there is the effort on the part of governments and super-government agencies to consolidate identity and practice. There's the idea of the acceleration of inequality between peoples. I made a reference to the 1%. One only has to look at social protests around the world to suggest that the gulf between the haves and the have-nots is widening. Now, it may have ever been thus, that there are poor and wealthy, but perhaps because of condition number 3, namely our immersion in what Smith calls the infoscape, the spectacle society and the distribution of instant digital images, that we are far more aware of the gulf between the vastly wealthy and the vastly poor, or the middle class. All of us have been paying attention to the current election for president, and wealth inequality has been both challenged as not being discussed enough, and yet it seems to be the elephant in the room. So thus, globalization, accelerated inequality, and immersion in an infoscape where information abounds. In these lights, I'm reminded of the work of Alan Gowans, a very eminent art historian, who in 1964 wrote a book called Images of American Living, in which he argued, which at the time radically, that architecture and furniture are history in its most tangible form. It's on that note that I would like to sort of talk about hyper-luxury and the reading thereof. If you think about the timeline of history, the question would be, how is it that today's conditions can explain today's productions? I suggested in our imaginary chapter that we would have to acknowledge the chapters of history, from Skara Brae through ancient Egypt, through Greece, through Rome, into the Gothic, the Renaissance, the Baroque, the Rococo, the acceleration of time, the historical revivals of the 19th century, technological progress, Thonet, other people, Masson, Alto, Eames, modernism, postmodernism, Shire, and company. If we accept that, then the question becomes, in the context of our imaginary chapter, how do we make sense out of today? Well, we have a cabinet by Etienne Boulet, and we have a piece by Studio Viziani called the Glitch Cabinet. I will come back to that. We have Skara Brae. This is the first time in recorded human history, in the history of furniture, that human beings fashioned objects in the context of domestic space for life. Now, this was discovered, if you can believe it, more or less intact, because it was filled with sand. It sits on the edge of a rocky island. And you can see that there's what seems to have been a bed and a shelving unit, sort of an earlier version of the home entertainment center, I suppose. And it's compelling. I suggested that postmodernism as a movement is vital to our analysis because as an ideological and cultural moment, postmodernism said the hegemony or the consolidated power of modernism must be broken. Rather than a type of progressive, forward, future-looking, international, universal aesthetic, we should be interested in history. We should be interested in the diversity of human experience across time and place. We should be interested in what Robert Venturi, the architect, said, complexity and contradiction. The idea that you could have the simultaneous existence of temporal planes. Modern means now, contemporary means now, but there's nothing within those words that would mandate that the things produced today need to look like today. One could look to the past. Philip Johnson, in designing the AT&T headquarters, which is now the Sony building, openly said that he was always an admirer of Philadelphia case goods from the middle of the 18th century. Philadelphia, the most refined city in British America. And here's an object. So a 1760 cabinet gives an architect working in the 1980s an inspiration for a pediment. So why not make a corporate office tower look like an 18th century highboy? In many ways, they make perfect sense. The highboy was the epitome of power and the representation of wealth and authority. Why not make the corporate skyline look the same? But what Johnson also did at the same time was to say to Mies van der Rohe and people over on Park Avenue, your black glass Darth Vader tower is done. Postmodernism allows us a type of playfulness, ironic approach to the material world. Ettore Sotstis. I show this because it's called the Carlton Room Divider. It's, I think, a very wonderful piece of furniture, and it exemplifies postmodernism's interested engagement with a type of cheeky critique of modernist practices. The fact that Sotstis called it the room divider was not that because it could sit in the middle of a room with things on both sides, because it divided opinion. It really would divide a room of makers about whether it mattered or not. Well, to bring us to the postmodern frame and hyperluxury. It's interesting to me as a cultural historian that in the United States, in the age of cartoons, two debuted in American television about the same time. One was the Flintstones. the idea of a type of Neolithic happy family riding around in rock cars, living in a rock house. The other was the Jetsons, the idea of the futuristic super-American family living in the space age. If you think about these two shows airing at the same time at the height of the Cold War, they become a type of moral parable of America at a certain point in time. On the one hand, there's this cautioning that should the Cold War not go its way, America would be bombed back to the Stone Age. This was an idea. The other is that technology will free us. And so the space race and that competitiveness with the USSR was sort of encapsulated in the idea of the happy American family living in an age of the future. Now, I would say in looking at the Jetsons' living room, we still have the type of domestic trope, patriarchy and domestic servitude. I've always said that the robot is in fact slightly styled as African American. So there is, even within the height of the Cold War, a type of racialization of the future. But I show you these two images because I think they get at something very important. Namely, at this point in time, we see this tension between possible futures. A possible future of retrogression and a possible future of advanced utopia, the utopia of scientific determinism and technology. Well, in terms of makers, hyperluxury, the scholar Dejan Sujic would say, is particularly difficult in the age of hyperabundance, and I think this is important to note. If you think about it, luxury as a concept has usually been defined by rarity, by an absence of things. If you think about the courts of Louis XIV and XV, and if you think about that phrase, things fit for a king, I was looking online recently and I found an ad for toilet paper with that moniker, fit for a king. Now, I don't know if monarchs would have different types of toilet paper than the rest of us. Perhaps they would. But if you think about that phrase when it first appeared, fit for a king, it suggested that there was a group of objects made by a very narrow, small group of makers of exquisite skill for the most powerful person within the context of a place. Something fit for a king was monarchical, royal, regal, unparalleled, unmatched. Today the phrase just exists to say it's good. So toilet paper fit for a king is probably not quite Louis XIV had in mind, but he had Etienne Buell make objects. One only has to think about the fate of Nicolas Fouquet, who was one of Louis XIV's ministers. He was a superintendent of revenue, and he constructed in 1655 to 1661 a really spectacular estate called Vaux-le-Vicomte, outside of Paris by 30 miles. And he employed all of the best designers, Lebrun, Lenotre, and created this absolutely spectacular, exquisite, enclosed and integrated world, the architecture and the gardens and the furniture and the tapestries and the food and the dress. He invited, of course, his sovereign to come to the opening celebrations, and as Voltaire joked later on, in the evening Fouquet was the king of France, and in the morning he was nobody. Louis had him imprisoned, confiscated the estate. The reason being wasn't so much that there was a suspicion, which his minister Colbert had put in his ear, that Fouquet was stealing from the royal treasury. It wasn't that. For Louis, it was, how dare you presume to be above me in station and goods? You are not the king, I'm the king. So Fouquet's effort at artisanal patronage ended in prison. But I think the point is worth considering. In that context of furniture making, monarchical making, kings were at the top of a pyramid. The people in their service producing the objects that now reside in museums were making masterpieces for monarchs. It was a relationship of patronage and commission. I don't think today monarchs are particularly front and center in the commissioning of objects. Some might be. But for the most part, there has been a shift from monarchical power to secular and, we might say, meritocratic power. Russian petrarchs, Hollywood royalty, people who have vast wealth and who have the capacity to acquire goods at what they would see as a corresponding level. What's different, however, is the marketplace. I don't know that the idea of royal warrants in this day and age would be particularly appropriate. You know, royal warrants, if you go through the streets of London, you can come across something and there'll be a sign on the top saying whatever, by appointment to. So today our model might be by appointment as chaise maker to the court of Brangelina. Mirror master to industry moguls Jay-Z and Lady Beyonce. Crib and playset fashioner to the house of Zuckerberg and Chan. It doesn't quite work. Obviously, it didn't work as a set of jokes. So it obviously doesn't work. But the point I'm trying to make is in the age of hyperluxury, what we see is an inversion of relations of patronage, what the art historian Baxendale calls makers and consumers and audiences, into a world of commerce. If you are of the 1%, how do you let people know? We can read hello, we can read people, we can look at news accounts, etc. But ultimately these people, as Ms. Atkinson pointed out, need furniture. So where would they get it? How would they find it? Professor Sujic in this says, as I'm going to repeat, the pursuit of luxury is more ubiquitous now than any previous moment in history. Everything is luxury. I read the Financial Times on a regular basis, and I'm always struck with the high glossy magazine that's produced every now and then, and the title, unabashedly, is How to Spend It. Now, it used to be said that if you had money, you had to keep it quiet, and you should never sort of show your wealth. But today, there's been a change. People like to let other people know that you're not me, and thankfully, I'm not you. So if we take that into the realm of making, and please understand, I absolutely revere makers. I know many. I visit studios all the time. I understand the creative energies applied and the technical expertise needed and the dedication. Didn't David Pye said a thing takes as long to make as it takes? The idea that time for makers exists differently. But I am also interested as a historian of the past and the present with the implications of what I see as this radically different landscape for some makers who've decided to turn their attention to the production of goods which can only be understood as hyper-luxury commodities. We have a model of display. There are gallerists who will mount shows using the same language and apparatus of the art gallery. So the idea that there'll be an invitation, there'll be a privileged bespoke catalog written. Critics, I've written them myself, critics and historians will be asked to write an essay. So what's called art writing. It's not exactly critical because you can't slam the person who's paying you, but it does have to be sort of in the zone of intellectually viability, so it'll be referenced, etc. But it operates as a type of secular hagiography of an object, cultivating legitimacy, when in fact all we're really doing in these galleries and writing about them is acknowledging that capitalism is the basis of everything. Everything is a commodity. Everything can be bought. The makers. I'm aware of time. I want to show you Martin Bass. Went to Eindhoven. His thesis show was a series of furniture. He was interested in the classics. And he went out and found things in thrift stores, he said, and he took a butane torch to them. And he burnt these objects and then coated them with this durable, non-permeable, clear epoxy. You think about this. In the context of postmodernism, this might be equivalent to Woolf's bonfire of the vanities. But in fact, it's not the vanity that's getting burnt, it's the chair that might go with the vanity. That Bass would take Rietveld, Hoffman, or Macintosh, he did them all, and Sotstis, and torch these objects. So it's a type of denunciation of the canon of furniture in order to create his own canon with a type of edge. His aesthetic varies wildly. He makes this type of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs object that are off-kilter intentionally. And I think the off-kilter piece is worth remembering. Mattia Bonetti, this is a cover picture from an article that How to Spend It featured. He has a remarkable catalog raisonné of his work. And he is a remarkable maker, self-taught, no formal training in an art and design university, and produces what he would describe freely as objects for the people who have discerning taste. What does he make? Well, this polyhedral chest of drawers, those fractured mirrored surfaces. I mean, if the whole idea of looking in a mirror is to get a sense of who you are, maybe this object, because it does have a reflective surface, is saying, well, we're multiple people at multiple times. There is something both seductive about its shape and, quite literally, jarring. His liquid gold cabinet. Now, the naming of a piece of furniture, chair, bed, Carlton room divider, liquid gold. It's sort of appealing. I always think when I look at this object, and the detail is particularly valuable, carnelian and alabaster and aluminum, cast aluminum with gold-plated drippings. I always think it looks like Daffy Duck, who's sort of had an accident at the top of the chest. But in fact what it is is liquid gold. Well, what better way to say, I am the new Louis XIV, or an equivalent, than having something like this? Zaha Hadid. And I want to put into this conversation that you keep in mind the Flintstones and the Jetsons. If those simultaneous temporal planes suggested the possibility of time being collapsed and mixed up, these objects that I show you represent what I see as the postmodern's engagement with the diversity of signs and symbols. Not because of the freedom that postmodernism accorded makers, but because there is no master narrative of furniture making. There is no linear history at this point. It's all just stuff. Amazing stuff, differently priced stuff, stuff made out of different materials. Stuff. Zaha Hadid, her moon system series. The idea of taking what are more or less biomorphic shapes, but giving them a type of intergalactic swoop. Her dune formation, bookshelf, and seat. As a semiotic entity, this can only take our minds to a future world. What world would it be? One of those dystopian worlds where human beings have left Earth and we're living on a floating ship? I think of WALL-E. Is it a world where, in fact, we've stopped hyperconsumerism and we're regenerating the Amazonian rainforest? Is it a world where we've explored galaxies, going to places no one's ever gone before? Zaha Hadid, I think, brilliant architect, a futurist, speculating an aesthetics of technological promise. Christopher Schenck, trained at the School of Visual Arts in New York and then at Central St. Martin's, Detroit-based maker, who by his own admission is interested in walking around neighborhoods and finding the detritus of the post-industrial world. Detroit might be a good place to do that. And what's interesting, in the same way that Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns would walk around the block around Coenty Slip, and whatever Rauschenberg would find, he would turn into one of his combines. Here we have Schenck, who goes out on these nocturnal and daytime visits to find stuff. He brings the stuff back to his studio and aggregates it. But the idea of taking trash and turning it into treasure, while perhaps laudable, there is embedded in this a type of recycling implication. Nonetheless, his objects become art furniture. And they exist not necessarily for the masses, but for the few. These evoke such feeling for me. They look like coral reefs, the idea of putting trash into the ocean and letting the sea take it over. They look like thrones. They remind me of, I think it's at the Smithsonian, that set of African-American furniture that's covered in foil. His obviously sort of Baroque bookcase that again looks accreted and growth-like. What would be the aesthetic import of this object? What are we to make of it? These things cost thousands and thousands of dollars. And so the aesthetic presentation of the object, the semiotic implication of the object, asks more questions than they answer. These are not for storage. They're not for use. They're for display. Max Lamb, based in the United Kingdom, went to the University of Northumbria and then did advanced study at Central St. Martin's. He describes himself as a maker using his hands. He makes stone furniture. He will buy blocks of uncut marble from quarries in China and will have them transported to London, right there, the costs of moving materials from one place to another for the fabrication of objects, and then will hand chisel these pieces. Now, not Flintstones exactly, but sort of. But for me, it raises implications about how such things would exist in the world. In the airport yesterday, there was a copy of The Real Deal. I don't know if you read this magazine. It's the New York Real Estate News. And this is the August edition, but in the middle of it was this wonderful sort of thing called Billionaires Row. And it talks about the creation of buildings that are as high as the former World Trade Center, which I find interesting in and of itself, that here we have this epochal event from years ago, 15 years ago now, in which tall buildings were targets. And now the super wealthy, whether they're real estate developers or the people who occupy the buildings that are created, have to furnish their objects. I don't know that Max Lamb's furniture could be in one of those buildings. I don't know what the sort of tensile strength of a floor plate would be. But the idea of higher and higher, literally and figuratively, and the need to furnish these spaces. Max Lamb's poly dining table. Here he takes blocks of solid polystyrene and takes a chainsaw and cuts them to make furniture. Easier to move, not as heavy as the stone furniture. but the same type of aesthetic, rocks. Why make furniture out of rocks? Why not? Postmodernism would say, if we can, we should. Fredrickson Stallard, a design duo based in London, both graduates of Central St. Martin's in furniture design. And they have several things I want to show you. The Crush collection. Here's this spectacularly shiny object that, again, is reflective surfaces. Think about reflection. We reflect on things, and things can reflect us. Here, in a piece of luxury furniture selling for $100,000 or so, you get this jagged surface. It's sort of John Chamberlain's furniture or sculpture brought forward. But rather than using automobiles that look as though they've been in accidents, here people literally take an object through very advanced fabrication techniques and produce this type of aesthetics of destruction. The Crush collection Hurricane Mirror. Naming itself is complicated. Obviously not to be used. Because could it be? Is there irony on the part of the makers? We don't want to see ourselves in this object. Too much looking and self-reflection might yield answers that we don't want to know. The Species Sofa. This is a phenomenally complex piece of furniture, intricate in its multiple layered interior. And it's covered with this type of velveteen surface. When I first saw this, and I've seen it in life, haven't sat on it, I thought immediately that it was a meteor. It looks like something traveling through space, or it looks like something that you would chip away. They talk about this as the embodiment of life and death. It's the colors of life, this type of blood. But how does it operate? Well, I would suggest that the furniture of Max Lamb, his rocks, and the luxury furniture of Fredrickson and Stallard are dealing with the same things. The idea of the basic elemental character of human life, looking for materials that have metaphor. But as an object, even in its seemingly ancientness, it speaks to the conditions of today. Lila Jang studied in Seoul and then at the École des Beaux-Arts Supérieure in Paris. She was deeply influenced in her practice by French furniture. She spent many hours at the Louvre, went, as she says by her own admissions, to all of the museums, and started to make furniture that references the French court. But here we have a type of distortion of monarchy, literally turning monarchy on its head. Ferruccio Laviani was commissioned early on to make a series of furniture which the title was, as you see printed whole, Fuck the Classics. So here he takes what looks to be a Louis XV bureau and puts in this laser-cut pink wound. And that's what it is. It's a wound in furniture history. It's sort of a denial of the past or a remaking of the past. The Good Vibrations Glitch Cabinet. This is the aesthetics of technological disaster, purposefully made by Laviani. Now, this is perhaps the most complicated piece of furniture I'm showing you today. It was modeled on a program that would allow to figure out how it could maintain its structural integrity. And then there was a question about doing two projects at once, having someone actually carve this from the design, or having a CNC laser router clean it out, or cut it out, which was what was chosen. Remarkably intricate piece of work. For me, it's about the distortion. We assume that somehow technology is going to be the salvation of the world, even though simultaneously it's leading us to destruction, Jetsons notwithstanding. Laviani, in his practice, makes these objects that bring in the forefront the fallibility of technology. If not the ghost, some type of specter. Studio Job, two graduates, a romantic couple for a while, not recently, now they're recently separated. Both went to Eindhoven, skilled makers, vast material vocabulary, deep understanding of making. Their practice has been defined and described by critics as whimsical, ideologically sharp, insightful. Their Robber Baron series, well, That's sort of rather direct. So if we know our American history, we know that the great age of 19th century industrialism with people like the Vanderbilts and all were known as the robber barons. The historian Vernon Parrington said that that period in time between the end of the Civil War to 1900 was described as the Great Barbecue. Kill it, roast it, claim it. This couple take that aesthetic and look at industrial factories and turn it into luxury. So cast bronze and then gold-plated. The Tales of Power, Corruption, and Art series, the robber baron credenza. The idea, quite literally, of opening up the origin of wealth. Here is an object of hyper-luxury that on the inside looks like ore. Yours, mine, and ours. Well, not ours, theirs. The robber baron armoire. The implication is that a cannon has shot a hole through this bureau. A counterpoint, the practice of the very talented and thoughtful Marlene Huissaud, also from Central St. Martin's. And you'll notice that there's this sort of focusing of artists coming out of that school in London that is a superb place for material study. She came from a family of beekeepers in France, and she decided she's interested in eco-waste, the things that are left over from natural processes. And so this is a press cake. She went to an olive oil plant and was struck by the pellets that get produced when the olives are crushed. And she decided, could this organic matter be transformed into furniture? Here's her stool. Has the capacity to hold body weight. It's now sold, and she would avowedly say that her ideological positioning doesn't allow her to participate in the luxury market. But nonetheless, as a studio maker, she values her labor. So there is a price tag attached to these noble efforts. So the elevation of the handmade into the realm of the culturally significant, of insects and men, beeswax and other substances turned into a vase. She's working on a line of furniture under this same idea, and vases. Antoine and Manuel. It's interesting, in this day and age, it's often hard to find biographies. Not much is known about this couple, other than they're known as Spain and France's most gifted graphic designers. And they made a series of digitally cut, CNC, credenzas that show the tableaus of life. I particularly like the sort of kitten dog underneath at the bottom and the sort of scale of the mountains. This is a visual tour de force. They have classical architecture. They have the flora. They have a landscape. They have human drama. Mathieu Lehenner. He was commissioned by Veuve Clicquot, very distinguished designer, also studied in Paris. He was commissioned by Veuve Clicquot, the champagne company, and a very distinguished hotel in Reims, the Hôtel du Marc, to create an environment for jet-lagged travelers. So the idea that you would have taken your transatlantic flight from somewhere to somewhere and you'd arrive by limousine at this hotel, and you would be quickly taken into this chambre du roi of sorts. And it's a temperature-controlled sleeping pod that changes the climate, produces very good air, dims the lights in certain ways, and allows you to have a very deep sleep. And then it wakes you up very slowly. Well, we know that Lehenner in his thing is referencing royal making. This is a chamber for a neo-king. If you are the type who travels globally up at the front of planes, who has a special lounge, etc., you might end up at the Hôtel du Marc, and you might, with your bottle of champagne, take a dream in a king's bedroom. Last piece I want to show you is a work that Lehenner made that I think exemplifies the capacity of digital technology in today's world, in which we have the ability to make things that may not be real, that give the consequence and effect of something. This is a sheet of marble that was digitally modeled and then cut using a laser device that's installed in the courtyard of a Loire Valley chateau. And it does look like a rippled pool. It reminds me of the gardens at Vaux-le-Vicomte or at Fontainebleau or Versailles. The idea that digital making has this immense capacity to simulate reality. The theorist Jean Baudrillard would say that one of the legacies of postmodernism is the fact that things that look real may not be real, and things that are real may not be recognized as such. In this day and age of contemporary furniture market making, in the realm of hyperluxury, you have a diversity of makers who are exploring any number of visual tropes. They are seeking to communicate to the wider world within the context of capitalism that these are perilous times, that luxury is all well and good, but luxury without responsibility might lead to doom. That said, I acknowledge that these are brilliant thinkers, exquisite craftspeople who have taken their talents and turned them to the fabrication of things that I imagine in many instances will grace the halls of the Metropolitan Museum and will be seen by future furniture historians as masterpieces of their time. We, however, may not be alive to read that chapter in the history text. When that's written, there will be the advantage of hindsight. There'll be the advantages of knowing how things turned out. At this point in time, I would think we're close to the edge of some type of precipice. And if hyper-luxury production is to tell us anything, it's that making in the service of money says a lot about the role of money in our world. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Michael. That was a fantastic start to the day. Very insightful. What are you? Oh, you need to get us started? Okay. All right. As Gloria gets us set up, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Paul Sacarides is a sculptor whose work has been included in exhibitions across the United States and internationally. He was a fellow with the National Council of Arts Administrators, served on the board of the National Council on Education for the Ceramic Arts, and is a member of the International Academy of Ceramics. Prior to his current position as executive director of the Haystack Mountain School of Crafts, he was professor and chair of the Department of Art at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I had the pleasure to visit Paul out at Haystack this summer. We had a fabulous time at the Haystack Summer Conference. He's doing amazing things out there. We, in fact, had a conversation out there to do with what Michael had just spoken about. Why do we need another chair? And it was a provocative and a fun week to be had. Paul's here to talk a little bit about what they're doing out at Haystack, producing furniture, and I don't know what else to say. Paul, come on up.
Thank you. I've just hit that point where I need bifocals, so I'm doing, and I'm trying to navigate that. I don't have them yet, and I need them. So, does this have a pointer on it, Nora? There it is. Okay, great. Well, good morning. That was a brilliant talk. I could have listened to that for the rest of the morning. So it's a pleasure to be here this morning and to be in the company of such remarkable people. Special thanks to Nora Atkinson, the Renwick Gallery, the Smithsonian, and the Maloof Foundation for making this possible today. Having the chance to be a part of conversations like the one that we're involved with, to ask questions, to posit ideas, to think carefully about the field we're so deeply involved with, is the reason we do the work we do. And what a privilege it is to be here. And in case you're wondering, yes, the place I live and work does look like this. So I want to talk about three things this morning in the time that we have together. First, I'm going to discuss the Haystack Mountain School of Crafts, the history of the school, where we're located, and how we think about the work we do. Then I'm going to talk about some observations I've made on the field, particularly the field we're talking about today. And these are, of course, just that. They're my own views on a field that's complex, broad, and constantly changing. What I'll focus on is fairly specific and just one part of a much larger whole. And I don't say that apologetically, I just say it for clarity up front. And finally, I'll talk about a project made by an artist that I feel ties together the first two parts of what I'm going to talk about, hits on how Haystack functions, and also deals with a broader involvement with technology and community. At least that's the hope in the next 30 minutes. So I came to Haystack having spent 18 years teaching in universities, most recently, as Nora mentioned, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I was both a professor teaching in the department and chair of the art department. And my career has always spanned three areas. Ooh, just a moment as my notes just disappeared. Well, that's interesting. Can we have a pause for just a moment, please? Thanks. No, it just decided to go to sleep. So I've always spanned three areas. I've spanned the areas of teaching, of administrative work, and making sculpture. And I've always liked all of it. And I was the guy who wanted to go to meetings. And it took years before I realized that most of the other people in the room did not enjoy them as much as I did. And over the years, my work has dealt with architecture, ornamentation, urban planning, and abstraction. At least these are the broad approaches I've dealt with for a long time now. I come out of a traditional base in ceramics. I'm not a furniture maker, but I've always been aware of and involved with conversations that extend beyond that being ceramics. And to be perfectly honest, I've always had a complicated relationship to craft, but that's also the thing that keeps me up at night. I loved being inside of a large research university. It was endlessly interesting to think about one set of ideas against another, and it was a real privilege to spend those years there and had a tremendous impact on my work. But I also wanted to make a change, and Haystack became the answer to that change. I had been a student here at Haystack 25 years ago. I returned to teach about 5 years ago in ceramics, and at each instance, the experience brought about a profound shift for me. And when I taught there last, I returned back to Wisconsin having seen a model of teaching and learning that I thought was more effective than the one that I was inside of, and in fact, the one that I was advocating for and running. And in choosing to come here, I felt that I had found a place where I could focus the work I was doing at an organizational level and also contribute to a meaningful discussion and evolution of a field at a time where it was poised for change. So that's a brief example of how I ended up here today, but in reality, I'm still really trying to figure out what happened. So this is my first full season as director. And I have the privilege of being the fourth director in the history of the school. It's 65 years old. There's only been 4 people running the school. And my predecessor, Stuart Kestenbaum, was the director for 27 years. So it's a big shift. And so for this one season, I had the recurring title by everyone that I met on the very small island of Deer Isle as being, quote, the new guy, the new director, etc. And I spotted a cashier wearing this ribbon at a grocery store earlier in the summer, and I all but stole it from her and pleaded to have one because I thought it was kind of the perfect segue. So in some ways, you only get to be new once, and perhaps a ribbon's a helpful reminder to others or ourselves. But I also really like the idea that we can get some patience as we figure things out. And more, I'm convinced we all need reminders like this in our daily life. Because the greatest hope as creative thinkers is that we can always find a way to be new at something. Perhaps, or even most importantly, at the thing we're most proficient with. It reminds us that the way we understand something is capable of shifting. So in case you have not visited us, and I hope you will, out of curiosity, by show of hands, how many of you have been to Haystack or are familiar with the area? Okay, thank you. So Haystack's located in Deer Isle, Maine. It's far from Washington, and in some ways, it's not really close to anything in particular, as Nora could attest to. I sometimes say that you should stop by and see us because we're only 5 hours from the end of any trip you might be taking. We sit on a granite ledge at the tip of Deer Isle, which is a coastal island connected to the mainland by a bridge overlooking Jericho Bay, and an archipelago of 60 coastal islands. It's actually the largest archipelago on the eastern seaboard. The stunning landscape was formed during the last glacial period, approximately 14,000 years ago, and put in perspective, you've been here for about an hour. So when we think about time, we talk a lot at Haystack about the way that time slows down and that it gives us a way to focus on our work. And I think in that way, the place where we sit really does underscore the work that we do. The school was founded in 1950 by Mary Beeson Bishop in Montville, Maine, not Deer Isle. And Montville is located inland, approximately 4 hours north of Portland. And at the time, that area was even more remote than it is today. And shortly after founding the school and coming up with the idea of creating a school, Francis Merritt was brought on as the school's first director, and momentum very quickly took place. The school was founded during a period of radical experiments in education and admittedly a complex time in American history, 1950. Put in a broader context, if we think about a few bookends, the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture was founded in 1946, Skowhegan, Maine, fairly close to Montville. And Black Mountain College, arguably the most impactful center of avant-garde American art and literature of the time, would close in 1957. So if you think of those two dates and those two institutions and where Haystack falls in between. The school is a radical idea in and of itself. And to imagine what it meant for a woman in 1950 in rural Maine to start this sort of project is a part of our mission that we're incredibly proud of. And I think that it took remarkable conviction. And in many ways, the mission that drove those early days of the school are still at the core of how we operate today. In the early days, workshops at the Montville campus were sited in these rustic, but quote unquote intentionally built cabins. And the first classes taught were in clay, weaving, woodworking, and printmaking. And this was not an insignificant decision, as it intentionally situated more conventional craft-based practices alongside a form that was distinctly outside of the tradition of handcraft. I was at this original site of the school 2 days ago with Al Merritt, which is Fran Merritt's son, and it was a remarkable day to be there with Al and to be actually at this cabin. It does not look this way anymore. The photograph looks a little bit like a horror film of these decrepit cabins. It's gone through multiple iterations over the years. And on a personal note, when I was there with Al, we discovered that he moved here with his father, his father is the director. When he, Al, the son, was 14, I just arrived at Haystack, and my son is 14, which means something and nothing all at the same time. So around 1955, 5 years into the program running, only running for very brief periods of time in the summer, primarily with the same rotation of faculty for the first few years, Route 3 was being constructed, and this was part of a larger program of road expansion in the United States. Highways are being built, roads are being beefed up, cars are being increased. And Route 3 would bisect part of the original site. And literally, as we stood in front of that cabin, the highway would have been where that banister is. And it would have radically changed what it meant to be in that place. It would have taken a rural and seldom traveled dirt road and transformed it into a main route, which would go across the state to access the north and south highway. So this was significant. And so a decision was made that they had to move the school to a new location. And primarily, the goal was to move it to a place where a highway would never be built. They chose there. And the school was here. So you go up, you go over, you go down, you cross a bridge, you cross a causeway, you cross another causeway and a last, and then right there is the school. So they succeeded on their first mission of moving the school. Ruth Asawa, Annie Albers, Paulus Berenson, Karen Carnes, just passed away, MC Richards, and many others spent time at Black Mountain and also at Haystack. As work on an exhibition which is being planned at the Portland Museum of Art, which will be opening in 2018, the ties between Black Mountain and Haystack are becoming even more apparent than previously realized, and it's an exciting project to be involved in discussions with the curators on, and some interesting discoveries are being made. And this seems particularly relevant, a particularly relevant moment to be thinking about this idea of Black Mountain as we're witnessing a renewal in interest of the school, and also in historical models of radical education in general. The recent exhibition, Leap Before You Look, organized by the ICA Boston, has been part of a larger conversation that's reinvestigating these various histories as a time when questions on the ethical and financial sustainability of higher education within the arts is unavoidable. And at the core, there seems to be a strong desire to investigate these sorts of ideas. This is what the land looks like. The campus itself is comprised of 52 acres, purchased for $2,500 at the time. Please support our annual fund. And it sits right on the Atlantic Ocean. It was designed by noted American architect Edward Larrabee Barnes, and as I mentioned, it sits on Jericho Bay. It's a breathtaking and dramatic place, and the campus is widely recognized for its integration into the site. Buildings are situated along granite hillsides that slope toward the Atlantic Ocean. And when the campus was built, very little was removed to accommodate the buildings. Everything sits on pilings, and the entire structure seems to float above the forest floor. And everything is in fact connected by this series of decks. So when you walk from the water, which will at the very base where we would be standing looking up, the entire campus is connected by these decks. So everywhere you go, community is created by how you traverse this floating landscape. And underneath, you'll see these boulders that are left in place, and moving all the way up, you'll see them situated underneath and sticking out from under buildings. And these were called glacial erratics, having been moved from the last glacial period. We always remind people they're not going anywhere. Barnes went on to have an amazing career, and since that time, the Haystack campus has been recognized with a number of architectural awards. It received the 25-year award from the American Institute of Architects in '94, which is given annually to a group of buildings more than 25 years old that have retained their design integrity. Rockefeller Center, the Guggenheim, and the Vietnam War Memorial all share this recognition. But Haystack might be the only one that was built for $5 a square foot. And it's interesting to think about this again in the light of skyrocketing costs that seem to be occurring these days in designing and building arts organizations. And we even came in 1960 when we moved here under budget, but in all fairness, we don't have heat. So it only runs from May through October. Today, Haystack is an international craft school that attracts students from 18 to 88. From beginning to advanced professionals, people come to work in studios that are open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, dedicated to really the same pursuits from when Mary Beeson Bishop started the school: clay, wood, metal, glass, fiber, graphics. The studios are modest in scale, and the entire campus designed to promote community and interaction. And the images I'm showing you tell the story of people at Haystack, because this is all where things really come alive. And I can think of fewer opportunities in our lives for people to work intergenerationally, where someone who can be 18 can work next to someone who's 88, where a college student can work next to someone who was retired from another career. We also bring in visiting writers, engineers, anthropologists, scientists, and thinkers from seemingly divergent fields. Our programming includes 2-week intensive workshops, conferences, as Nora mentioned, symposiums, and an open studio residency program for emerging and established artists. We have a history of publishing, and each year we produce a short monograph on craft, and in most cases these have been produced by people from outside of the field of craft, seldom produced by scholars within the field. And again, that's an intentional way to try to think about the act of making through a broader lens. We're not a traditional craft school, but we do teach through traditional craft media. And our role has been as a thought leader for both preserving the tremendous legacy of American craft, of which we have played a key role, and asking challenging questions about where the field can go. So as director, I see my role as continuing the school as a think tank where we can bring the most brilliant people we can find. We give them time and space, access to studios and materials, and most importantly, time with one another to see what might be possible if we ask interesting questions. It's a simple idea that has had tremendous impact. And if you've not already seen, it's an incredibly beautiful place. These are sleeping cabins. Another example of how things are up on pilings to accommodate the slope of the ledge. And there's a really special way in which a craft school functions. It's very different from the pedagogy that functions within a university. And part of it relies on a peer-to-peer learning network. It very much relies on a breakdown in hierarchy, and it relies on spending long periods of time together. And this is the dining hall. And the scale of Haystack is really critical. The school can hold 100 students. We have no plans of increasing, and when I was hired on as director, one of my biggest points was that I would not do an expansion of the campus. So if they wanted to double the size of the school, there would be other people that would be better to take on direction of the school. This was particularly relevant for me coming from an academic institution that was about growth, and I felt was growing too large, and to a degree that I thought at times was questionable in ethics. We have digital technology that I'm going to talk about in just a moment. This is the main deck with the entrance to the dining hall overlooking the water. And this happens every day. Someone who taught for us recently, in fact, was with Nora and I this summer at the conference, called me midsummer from another craft school and said, she was there, and I said, "How is it?" And she said, "It's pretty good, but they don't have enough dessert." That craft school will go unnamed. It's a good place, but we all have our shortfalls. And so in this particular context, I'm going to talk about our Fab Lab, which is a collaborative project with MIT. This is Neil Gershenfeld. And Haystack's involvement with digital technology began in 2004. And in 2011, we were able to build a lab. Neil works with the Center for Bits and Atoms at MIT, where he's director of research. He runs an incredibly sophisticated lab that's working at the forefront of physical and computer science. This means the interaction between hardware and software, mechanical tools, and the code that makes them work. Neil's one of those brilliant people that has inspiring ideas about how the world can work, and he sees it as incredibly malleable, the world. He originated the idea that there could be small-scale digital fabrication labs in divergent places across the globe, from Afghanistan to Madrid, from remote places in Africa to New York City. He thought of this as he sat in a $100 million facility at MIT and realized no one would ever have access to this. And his interest has been in democratizing technology. And so the logic is that each fab lab, ours included, has the same equipment: a laser cutter, a CNC router, a vinyl cutter, 3D printer, electronics equipment for making circuitry, etc. It's sophisticated, but it's also fairly streamlined in what's there. And each lab would also have shared software, primarily open source, meaning that innovations and lessons from one lab could be modified for use in another. And at the core, it's an idea that's based on democratizing technology, putting advanced manufacturing in people's hands. And this has been done without an end goal in mind, which I think is one of the most beautiful things about the lab. In that there's different sorts of results that can emerge, from solving design problems at a very sophisticated level to printing a new part for a broken bicycle in an economically impoverished neighborhood. So it empowers people to be actively involved in the world through making things. This is my predecessor. You know, I had the good fortune of following the world's nicest guy. You know, it's great to come into an institution where things are bad because you look good really fast. I came into a situation where everything was great, and I was asked if I could juggle. That was the biggest question that I had. And so when Stu met Neil, someone made a joke, and they said, "Oh, there's this guy around. You should meet him. He's a computer scientist. You're a poet at a craft school. Ha, ha, ha. What could you possibly have in common?" And what they had in common was curiosity. And Neil has come to love Haystack, and we're very fortunate. He comes every summer to the lab to update the software, install new drivers, bring machines to us. It's kind of like if you bought a Maserati and the guy who invented it changes your oil and cleans the windshield for you. But what Neil has talked about in very articulate terms, and I said to him, "Why do you come here? He's around the globe on a constant basis. And he said, because things are learned in this lab that aren't learned in others, and that there's a way in which the technology works and that people use it that is different from the way that a scientist uses it. And he has rewritten code based on the way that artists use machinery that then goes into the international global network of fab labs, because they would tend to think of a machine talking to a machine in a certain way, and we would say, this machine cuts flat things that are non-porous. And someone walks in and says, I have this wavy thing with a lot of porosity, I'd like to cut it. And we say, well, it doesn't do that. And somebody says, really? Why? And they put it in the machine and it does something unexpected. To an artist, this is basic. This is what we do, we mess with stuff, right? But to a scientist, that's not the way you do it. And so the lab has been revolutionary for us, and I think also for the bigger picture. The way that the lab works, which is relevant to talk about here, is that it's staffed by what Neil calls gurus. And I love the kind of quasi-spiritual and directional quality that term has. They are generally graduate students from MIT, Harvard Graduate School of Design, AS220, and labs in other parts of the world. These are incredibly sharp, brilliant people, generally coming to us in the midst of doctoral work. We had a woman here recently who was making a device to find the center of the universe. No one quite knew what that meant, but it was incredibly impressive as a project. We don't teach dedicated classes in the Fab Lab, so you can't take a workshop in Fab Lab. The Fab Lab exists as a hub that people channel into to use and to ask questions that help break apart the division between studios. And so we allow this weighing of clay, not in the Fab Lab, next to 3D printing this object next to CNC cutting out parts for something. And this is the way in which the gurus might work. Every 2 weeks, everything at the school changes. So if you ever think of a great model, our idea of a great model is to create it and then change it every 2 weeks. We bring in great faculty, and after 2 weeks they leave, and all the students leave, and the gurus leave. And a whole new set of people comes in, and the entire school reinvents itself. The lab is also based on part of a larger model philosophically of replication, both in terms of machines that make machines. Again, that phrase of machines that make machines, which is a developing thread in Neil's research at MIT and with Fab Labs in general. The idea that the lab could replicate itself technology-wise, and also in how we think about knowledge transfer between people. When you come in to use the lab, to make something, it's not a job shop. So you come in, you meet the guru, you tell them what you want to do, they think about the viability and ask questions, they help think through what you would need to do and what you need to know, and then they proceed to point you in the direction to figure it out. And so as a student or a participant, you're actively engaged in that learning. And that is an incredibly important part of this facility. There's almost as much talking as there is making going on. In the winter, when we're no longer on campus, we extend the Fab Lab out to the local community of Deer Isle, which is a rural fishing village, and we make the equipment available to elementary and high school students. Oh my goodness, I'm short on time. And so we believe that the shop should stay moving. And I'm just going to go through these few other pictures of the campus. And so the beauty of the school is that different things are happening in very different ways simultaneously. This was a drawing for raising a copper bowl, and the concentric circles were a recording mechanism for how small it was getting. Someone actually left this. They thought that was just a diagram. Or here a poet that attached a stylus to the CNC. So looking around over the past number of years, I think it's easy to say and to observe that craft is changing. think in the past we had a model that was very much in terms of pedagogy based on working in a very deep way to learn a specific skill and to reproduce that object at times ad nauseum. But there's a generation of students, given that I'm down on time, I'm going to close the notes. There's a generation of students that I think have grown and developed who are much more nimble in how they're thinking. They're much more aware of the landscape of contemporary art. This is Andrea Zattel. This is Adam Manley, who just took over the position at San Diego State in furniture. I don't think that 40 years ago you would think of this as a person running a furniture program. Katie Hundle. This is Roxy Payne's work, which is all fabricated in wood, which is actually only 15 feet deep of this TSA checkpoint, and everything is meticulously fashioned. So does this fall inside of craft? Does this fall inside of what we would be looking at in a curriculum for craft students? Did he make it? This is Matthias Pleissnig, who makes stunningly beautiful objects. He perhaps makes 1% objects. Interesting question. This is all steam-bent wood, clamped together, an incredibly meticulous craftsman. And again, someone who is incredibly aware of the larger worlds of design and contemporary art in a way that there is no gap between. And so the work of Tom Sachs for this generation is as much of a touchstone as the work of, say, Wendell Castle. And this kind of slapdash aesthetic of Tom Sachs' work, I think, has become kind of a battle cry to an entire generation of students and also of artists in general. His film, A Love Letter to Plywood, I would argue is perhaps one of the more influential films, I would say, in terms of materiality and craft. This shows you where the grain runs. And they're funny, they're poignant. Another film called The 10 Bullets, I'll speed it up, which shows you how to organize your shop. And that's countered also with recent work, such as this publication of Mortise and Tenon, which is a hybrid between an academic journal and a how-to manual for hand woodworking. And this is published on the Blue Hill Peninsula. To Michael Swain's work in San Francisco, where he has built this cart to repair people's clothing. To Theaster Gates' work with the Yamaguchi Seoul Manufacturing Company, which he set up a pottery which has less to do with making pottery and more to do with urban revitalization. And here, a project for Dorchester, where he is essentially buying up buildings on the south side of Chicago and working with them to create more of a greater sense of community in those locations of people. And so in closing, I would argue that we're at a moment where pedagogically the field is shifting, and a school like Haystack can't look the way that it's looked, and that we have to be answering to questions and engaging in a dialogue that considers the wood house as much an object of wood, the idea of a pottery that is set up under the moniker of a pottery, or the notion that an artist can work in social spaces to have an active engagement with community, is perhaps the counter to the 1% collection that we just talked about. And I think it's one of the most critical places where people are working today. So thank you.
Well, so now we're getting a bit of a feel of the energy of the day, and I think it's quite broad and quite interesting. And for those of us who are curious, it creates an opportunity to say, wow, how are these ideas connected, and what do they tell us about ourselves, and what do they say about the future? So to continue on that theme, I want to show you all this book. Have you seen this book? This is Now I Sit Me Down, by our next presenter, Witold Rybczynski. This book has been out for a couple of weeks. The subhead on it is From Klezmos to Plastic Chairs, A Natural History. And I want to tell you a little bit about Witold so that you'll know he knows what of he speaks. Witold Rybczynski is a writer and emeritus professor of architecture at the University of Pennsylvania. He's the author of How Architecture Works and the book Home, the Most Beautiful House in the World. He has also written about architecture and design for The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New York Times, and Slate. Witold is an ardent scholar of chairs, from folding stools to rocking chairs, in cultures from ancient Egypt to the 21st century. He studies chairs, he appreciates chairs, he sits in chairs, and he's here today to share some insights. Witold?
I've got 30 minutes, so I'm not going to thank anybody. But I would like to thank our keynote speaker, because he asked a question, do we need more chairs? And it reminded me that I actually answer that question in my book, and I thought I would just read you this, because I think it relates very much to that. And I'm quoting from a news article, I think it was 2012 or 2014. A report released Tuesday by a team of researchers at the Brookings Institution has confirmed that the United States currently has enough chairs, and there is no urgent need to produce new ones. Representing a 5-year inquiry into the nation's seating availability and quality, the 85-page study of American homes, offices, dining establishments, public spaces, and patios has determined that for now the nation has plenty of chairs and can get by just fine with the chairs it already possesses. According to the report, chair production can cease entirely with no negative effects on the American consumer, as the many good chairs now on store shelves and available at garage sales are sufficient to satisfy the country's seating requirements for the immediate future. Though some citizens reportedly believe that they require more chairs, the study found that most had not taken into full consideration the number of armchairs, folding chairs, Adirondack chairs, leather chairs, swivel chairs, and rocking chairs already in existence, not to mention all the beanbag chairs, wingback chairs, director's chairs, recliners, papasan chairs, and deck chairs. This was a report from 2012, but it was in The Onion, so it was a satirical report. But I think when I read it, and I think when you listened to it, it didn't sound completely like satire. There is certainly truth in it, and like all good satire, there is truth in it, in satire. And so I don't think chairs are very important. I quote somebody in the book, a design theorist and historian, who said that the chair is what you need when you don't need anything at all. And the truth is, you can sit on anything. You can sit on the ground, you can sit on a box, you can sit on a ledge, you can sit on a tree stump. So the chair, almost by definition, is a kind of extra. About 15 years ago, I wrote a book, The History of the Screwdriver and the Screw. It was called One Good Turn. And I call this talk a tool for sitting, but the chair is actually a very different sort of tool. Of course, it has a practical purpose like a screwdriver. It does a job. But I've learned that it's also a very personal kind of tool. There are very few people who have a favorite screwdriver. I mean, a screwdriver is just something that's in the kitchen drawer, and when you need it, it's there, and it does a job. It's done the same job for several hundred years. But we have favorite chairs. We have my chair, the chair I sit in after work, or the chair I read in, or the chair I watch television in. So chairs are different. They're personal, and there are other differences, as you'll see in a minute. I thought this is the most famous Sam Maloof chair, so I wanted to talk a little bit about rocking chairs. This talk is mostly about the past. I don't know what the future holds. And we're always surprised by the future anyway. It's always safer to look backwards and see what we can learn. So I wanted to talk about the rocking chair. And the rocking chair is a very mysterious human device because the cradle has been known since the Middle Ages. The cradle was invented in the Middle Ages because we discovered that babies cry less if they move. And of course, you can move the baby, but if you put it in a cradle, you can do something else while the cradle rocks. And so people knew this, and rockers are around for hundreds of years, and yet nobody thinks to put a chair on them. I'm not sure why. I speculate in the book that partly it's because, certainly in the Middle Ages, chairs were so big and heavy that putting one on rockers wouldn't make much sense. It would be a sort of lumbering sort of thing. But also because chairs, for the longest time and still today, are associated with status. When I was teaching, I had a chair. I had a chair, but I had a university chair, which was a mark of status in the university. So the idea of putting a chair on something that moves back and forth seems very frivolous and kind of outlandish. And certainly that's what Europeans thought when they came to America, where the rocking chair was invented. They thought we were kind of goofy. Back and forth, back and forth. I mean, what's wrong with these people? I'm not quoting, but these are the gist of some of these visitors. They say Americans are so nervous, making money, that they can't stop. They have to keep moving even when they're relaxing. The chair, actually, the rocking chair was invented somewhere, we don't know exactly who, but it was certainly in the Philadelphia area, because there's the oldest evidence of a rocking chair is a receipt from a chair maker for a nursing chair on rockers. We know that this actually isn't the first rocking chair, but it's the earliest one we know of. This is roughly about 1740. It would have been a chair something like this. A nursing chair was a low chair without arms that a mother could sit in and hold the baby and have enough space without the arms to rock it back and forth. And so it was a pretty obvious connection, but it took several hundred years to put a chair on rockers, and then you could hold the baby and rock at the same time. So rocking chairs are an American invention, and they're an invention that catches on. It's initially used mainly by women, but somebody sits in a rocking chair, a man sits in a rocking chair and finds that it's actually quite pleasant, and I'll talk about why in a minute. And so the rocking chair becomes something for men and women. And there's Mark Twain sitting in a North Carolina type of rocking chair, which uses a weave for the back as well as the seat. So it's a little more comfortable. It lets the air through as well. The one on the left is actually a European painting by Munch, but it looks like a Boston rocker, which was a particular kind of rocking chair. So it became really a craze in this country. Every household had at least one rocking chair in it, and it spread literally like wildfire. It was like the hula hoop craze, but it lasted longer. And because it was invented here, it of course started here, and as I said, European visitors were struck by this, and many of them write about it because it's such an unusual thing. No such chair existed anywhere else. This is a very American posture. I learned this from reading about chairs. Leaning back on the back legs of a chair is something that arguably men, I'm not sure if women do this too. My wife always scolds me when I do this. But this is an American habit. I'll leave it to psychologists to figure out why Americans do this, but when Tonet started exporting bentwood chairs to America, he discovered this. He discovered he had to reinforce the bentwood chairs because the back legs keep breaking because Americans kept leaning back. This is a rocking chair, so it's actually made for that. And you can see that the interesting thing about rocking chairs is they're not really about rocking, I think. The great advantage of a rocking chair is that a rocking chair is like the tilt mechanism on an office chair. You can lean back and just stop. And you can change your posture, and of course that's what he's doing. He's not rocking, he's just changing the angle of the seat. And in fact, office chairs started life in the home. The revolving, tilting chair is not an office device, it's a domestic device, and so there's a connection. People like those chairs. The rocking chair precedes it slightly. The rocking chair gets exported or imported by the Europeans. I would say the idea gets imported because Tonet figures out that the rocking chair would be a great thing to make out of bent wood, because since you're bending wood anyway, you're making the rockers immediately out of bent wood. And of course the Tonet chair is a much more elegant rocking chair. Rocking chairs are really ugly chairs. I'm sorry, Mr. Maloof, but it's not a great chair. It looks like a chair with some weird mutant thing stuck on it. These are beautiful objects, and it's the continuity of the rockers and the arms and everything. It really becomes a sculptural thing, and which is why it appealed to artists so much. And Impressionists painted these Tonet rockers. Tonet rockers are about 1860, so pretty early. And they become somehow associated by artists with probably the sculptural shape, and they show up in a lot of Impressionist paintings. The rocking chair gets a revival in America when John F. Kennedy introduces the rocking chairs into the Oval Office. Kennedy had a back problem, and his doctor said, you know what, maybe you should get a rocking chair, because the doctor also had a back problem. She recommended this North Carolina rocking chair, the one with the woven cane on the back and the seat. And Jacqueline Kennedy had these kind of hokey but probably comfortable bits made for it to make it a little more comfortable, these padded things that are laced onto it. And John Kennedy had these everywhere. He had one in Air Force One. He had them at Camp David. He really believed in this. And of course, it wasn't that he was rocking back and forth, but the occasional movement did something in his spine that was positive. I hate to imagine what these three are concocting around this coffee table. Concocting. Here's an interview with John Trump and Pence on 60 Minutes, and I show this in this talk because they're sitting in these Louis XV chairs. And Louis XV chairs are actually perfectly good chairs. They're excellent chairs because they represent in some ways the acme of chair making. They're padded in all the right places. They have these padded elbow rests. It's just unusual to see an American politician sitting in one outside the Élysée Palace. It's a chair that we associate with French politicians, not with Americans. These, I hasten to say, are made in USA. A reader emailed me about this, and she said she saw them being made in the 1980s in Los Angeles. But there is an ironic twist because they were made by illegal Mexican immigrants. This quote is important for me in the book because George Kubler was an art historian at Yale, and he wrote a wonderful book called The Shape of Time. And he made this statement that everything comes from something that precedes it, and that you can in fact follow this. He was talking about art, but it I think applies to artifacts as well, that you can follow this all the way back to the very beginning, and as he poetically says, the first morning of human time. And so I'd like to do this, to look at one particular kind of chair in this way. This is Philip Sheridan and his generals meeting during the Civil War. So we're talking 150 years, almost more or less. This is sometime in the 1860s. And they're all sitting on folding chairs, and campaign furniture is a sort of subcategory that is very interesting, and I talk about in the book. It starts with the British, basically, but there's some really interesting chairs. How do you make a chair that you can roll up or fold up or collapse it in some way and when you're changing camp. And so all of these are folding chairs of one kind or another, but it's the, is it this? Whoops. I better not use this. The gentleman on the right is sitting on a folding stool. I don't know if he's a lesser general. He doesn't seem to be, but in any case, he's sitting on a folding stool, and that's what I wanted to look at, because if you went to Home Depot, you could buy virtually the identical stool, made out of different materials, out of aluminum and either canvas or nylon, but it's virtually the same stool. This is really such a great device, because what's so wonderful about it, other than the fact you can just fold it up, it weighs nothing, it's easy to make, and you can fold it up and carry it, take it with you, is that the heavier the person is, the more the canvas stretches. The trouble with canvas seats is that they tend to collapse over time, whereas this, because of the X shape, the weight pushing down stretches the canvas even more. That's one of the interesting things about chairs that I found writing the book that became a theme, is that chairs have a very long life, a useful life, much longer than most things. And partly because if they're well made, they don't fall apart. But you know, this idea goes back to the Civil War. It actually goes back much, much further than that, as you'll see. And we can't improve on it, so why bother? Why improve on it? We use different materials, but it's a perfectly useful chair. That hardly is true of anything else. I mean, a Civil War gun would be kind of useless today, except for a collector or a history buff. But the Army would not distribute Civil War guns to its soldiers, but the Army would distribute these kind of stools. Almost, and many technologies, I mean, the electronic technologies that we're so proud of last, a few years, and then they're superseded by something else. I'm old enough to have seen 3 generations of music players. I had LPs, then I had cassettes, now I have CDs. I'm not changing again. But it will change again. So the younger people here are going to have to replace their CDs with whatever else comes along. So these things, but I have a chair that's 30 years old that I bought used in a flea market, and it's still useful, and it will remain useful. So chairs are very interesting in that way, and I think that's why designs survive. Windsor chairs are really marvelous design chairs. And in a sense, we don't need more chairs, because once you have Windsor chairs, you hardly need more chairs, and that's why we still make Windsor chairs, because they're a very good chair. We use automated lathes. We still make them out of wood, although not the same woods as were used originally, but the design is identical, and the principles are identical, which is you have a big, heavy seat, and then everything goes into holes. It's a crude chair. You don't need to be a craftsman to make a Windsor chair. You just need a drill, because it's all based on pegging into holes, and the feet go into it, that hoop goes into it, the spindles go into it. But 100 years before the Civil War, George Washington had these camp stools made. You can see one in the Smithsonian. He had about 20 of them made by a Philadelphia furniture maker, virtually the same as the previous 2 stools. These, I think, are made of leather and wood. But if we go back a little further to the 17th century, you have these rather ornate and grand stools which work on the same principle. So this camp stool clearly has precedence. They didn't make camp stools in the court of Louis XIV, but they made these tabourets. And those are versions of something in the Middle Ages, of folding stools in the Middle Ages. Here's a monk in a library copying on this this is related to the scissors chair, because it's rather than 2 X's, there's a kind of series of X frames, which makes it a little bit stronger and more durable than the other kind. And if the arms go up, it really becomes a kind of armchair. And there are many thrones from the early Middle Ages that are based on this. So why would a camp stool be a throne? It seems like an odd relationship. And that really comes back to the Romans. You can sort of make it out in this Roman coin. The emperor is sitting on a X-frame stool. And in ancient Rome, the sella curulis, which was what they called the stool, was a special seat for judges and important people to sit on. It was a symbolic seat as much as it wasn't simply a camp stool. It's that symbolism that migrates to medieval Europe, and then those stools become used as thrones. The sella curulis sometimes had arms. This one doesn't, but sometimes the legs curve up into arms, but they never had backs. And it was said that this was so that the judges, because judges sat in these, would not make long deliberations, because you do need a back to support the chair. As a footnote, one of the things I learned reading and studying about chairs is that sitting is really a chair, a tool for sitting, is always a kind of compromise. That the human body is made for walking and running, and it's made for lying down. Because we need to lie down, we recharge every night, right? But sitting is actually not, the human body isn't made for sitting, and we have these sitting bones which interfere, and so you have to make something soft. If you sit on something hard, or that doesn't take some shape, you're going to feel uncomfortable. If you sit for any length of time, you start to cut off the circulation to parts of your body, and that feels uncomfortable. So you move, you cross your legs, or you move around. It's basically impossible to make a good chair. It's always this sort of compromise, and yet we'd get tired. We want to sit down, and in a more complicated way, which I won't go into here, I mean, we do move up and we develop furniture with all kind of uses for dining, and we could do that sitting on the ground, but we've chosen to sit up higher. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But the Romans didn't invent the X-frame, so here's this fresco that was discovered at Knossos in the palace, which is called the camp stool fresco because the discoverers really thought these were like British camp stools. And these are two young men having a party or something, so this seems to be not a grand chair. It seems to be a pretty kind of utilitarian chair with some sort of cushion, or maybe a sheepskin or something is lying on it. The oldest examples, let me jump. The oldest example of a folding stool, there are two examples, and they're from radically different parts of the world, so it's a kind of puzzle. Did one copy the other, or did they just develop separately? This is an Egyptian folding stool. The seat is missing, but you have to imagine a laced kind of seat with all those little holes on the top bar. This is a rather fancy one. This is the 2% version it's got inlaid wood and carved animals. But we also know from tomb paintings that there were rather simple ones. So here you have people waiting, or they look like maybe students, people working on stools. So they were everyday objects as well. They were both fancy stools, but also rather commonplace stools. The other place where we have discovered a stool is in Denmark, and it dates from roughly the same time. And it was dug up. It's basically a wooden frame. The frame must have been in a peat bog or something. It was entire. There's an X-frame, and then there's a fragment of caribou hide or some sort of hide, which means the seat was leather. And it's basically the same as these. So how did it get from Egypt to Denmark, I don't know. It feels more likely that it developed separately in some sort of parallel way. The oldest chair I found was was actually a sculpture of a chair. This is about a foot high. And it's from the Cycladic culture, which is the culture that precedes ancient Greece on the islands around the mainland Greece. And there's a number of these sculptures that have survived. They're generally of musicians. Sometimes they're on stools. But he's sitting on like a kitchen chair. And it's not a throne, clearly, because he's a musician. It's a kind of practical chair. When I saw this at the Metropolitan Museum, I was flabbergasted because it was this entire perfect little chair. The Egyptians did not use chairs. They used throne-like chairs for very important people, but you never see any paintings of ordinary people sitting in anything like a chair. They're sitting on stools. So here was this perfect chair, and it's 27 to 2800 BC, so it's really, really old. The problem is the Cycladic culture didn't, as far as we know, develop writing. So there is no written record of anything from this culture. All there is a bunch of these various sculptures. You notice the face, it looks very much like a Modigliani or a Hans Arp or something. So these were discovered in the early 20th century, and art collectors collected these. So the tombs got totally pillaged. So we have a very kind of sketchy idea of this culture, where they lived, how they lived. We just don't know. So clearly they were a chair-sitting culture, but more than that, we really don't know. Of course, not everybody sits on chairs, and there are very advanced, sophisticated cultures which simply sat on mats on the floor. Here's one example. Oops. Something got mixed up here. The Japanese are the most famous example of a floor-sitting tradition. They knew about chairs. They simply chose not to do them. So it's not a question of evolution or not knowing it or inventing it. It really is a cultural choice. It's a choice, by the way, which has huge implications on things like architecture, because ceiling heights don't need to be very high if you're sitting on the floor. In fact, if you're sitting on the floor, a very tall ceiling might be unpleasant. It affects clothing. It affects the way people eat. So it has lots of repercussions. The Chinese, like the Japanese, were also a floor-sitting culture, but we know that around 100 AD they introduced these folding stools, and they called them barbarian beds, because in Chinese culture, barbarian simply meant not Chinese, humble as they are, and bed was simply because the Chinese sat on beds. Beds were sometimes used as kind of a dais or platform, but they didn't sit on anything else. So they had a sense of, they used the word because bed was what they sat on. So a barbarian bed was as close as you could get to the folding stool. What's interesting about the folding stool is that it was strictly used outside. It was never used indoors. It was only used outside, and the parallel is the way an American family will have a blanket on the floor, on the ground for a picnic, but if you went to somebody's house and they put a blanket on the floor for dinner, you'd feel very strange. And the Chinese was kind of the opposite. They had these stools, but they never used them inside. Inside they sat on the floor or on these heated platforms, because in northern China it was very cold, and so you would heat, the platform was heated and you could sit on blankets on top of it. They eventually developed portable platforms for summertime that you could take outside, because they liked the idea of sitting up for some reason. And this has the same name as the other platform, even though it's wood and portable. And out of that comes a chair. Some of these platforms had backs, so you could lean against them. And so if you have a platform that's 18 inches high and it has a back, you're almost at the chair. And if you put your legs down and lean out, you've got the posture. I believe posture always comes first. People don't invent chairs and then sit on them. They sit in that chair-sitting posture, and then they invent a chair that will support them. And here's from the 900 AD party where some people are on chairs, some people are on this platform, which is sort of like a sofa, but they're sitting cross-legged or they're leaning against the platform. So you've got this sort of transition period where people are, what they're not doing is sitting on the floor. There's no mats on the floor. Nobody sits on the floor. So China moved radically from one thing to another, which of course is not a surprise because they within our lifetimes, they moved radically from being a so-called third world country to being a competitor. So that same dynamism was evident in this time. We're talking, of course, about the early Middle Ages in Europe, when we were sort of staggering around without chairs of any kind, maybe a stool, occasional benches, but nothing as sophisticated as the Chinese chairs. Here's the emperor on a chair. They're very democratic, the Chinese chair. It's not just a throne. It's all over the place. And let me go through very quickly. They developed a folding model, which was unusual. This post-dates when they shift the chair, so this wasn't a shift from a stool to foldings there, but this folding chair was an indoor chair and a very prestigious indoor chair that was given to guests and important people. And it has, when the Europeans started importing Chinese goods, porcelain, furniture, and so on in the 18th century, you can see the effects of these chairs. Here's a folding chair, steamer chairs from the late 19th century. Rattan is another Chinese invention. Deck chairs are kind of simplified versions of those chairs. I'm going to have to go through very quickly. We're running out of time. The director's chair, actually invented in 1892, long before movies. So it's only when movies took up director's chairs and put names on the back, like Howard Hawks has here, that they somehow that name stuck to it and it became a popular chair and still is. The lawn chair, not a great chair in terms of design museums, but I think a really sophisticated design, very light. You can leave it outside. It's easy to fold, unlike a deck chair. It's durable, inexpensive, really a very sophisticated chair, invented by a man in Brooklyn. And then the very simple metal folding chair. I'll just finish off with the one-piece air chair, which is a design by Jasper Morrison, but there's many plastic chairs. The one-piece plastic chair, I think, is our period's great contribution to chair design, the 1% chairs notwithstanding. This really is a revolution because in some ways the history of chairs is the history of chair makers trying to get rid of joints. Tonnet, when he creates bentwood furniture, it's to get rid of the joints so he can have legs, back, and legs with one piece of wood. He just eliminated about 3 or 4 joints. The plastic chair eliminates all the joints. There are no joints. It's just one piece of plastic. It's made in, of course, it's molded. There is no craftsmanship. Nobody touches it. It's 60 seconds from when the pellets go in the machine to the finished chair coming out of the machine, which is why it costs about $10 at the lowest end. So whatever the future of the chair is, somehow it connects to this, I believe, in some way, because it's such a global chair. The thing that's most striking about the plastic chair is that it's the chair that becomes globalized. It's produced in all countries of the world. It's produced in Africa and Asia, East Asia, the Middle East. You see, if you watch the news carefully, you'll see plastic chairs everywhere. Whenever there's a meeting of people, they're likely sitting on plastic chairs, or you'll see them in the streets. And it really is the global chair. And finally, just to finish off, what strikes me about the chair is that, of course, the chair changes as a function of how you make it, whether you're making it in a factory or whether craftsmen are making it, what you're making it out of. Wood was the material of choice for millennia, but then you get metal, all kind of fibers and plastics, and finally all plastics. And yet at the same time, the chair really doesn't evolve. I mean, you can't say that the Eames chair is better than the Chippendale chair. It's just a different chair. It's made out of different materials. It doesn't represent a step forward in chairs. They're both perfectly good chairs. And that's why I think chairs do have such a long life, because in the body doesn't change, tastes change. We may at one point think the Eames chair is hopelessly out of fashion. We don't think that today, but who knows in 50 years what people will say. The same thing, we like ergonomic chairs, but ergonomic chairs are not perfect chairs. They're very good chairs. I used one myself, but you still have to get up and walk around because you're always fighting the body, which really doesn't want to be seated for long periods of time. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks so much, Vitold. We have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions, so if I could have the speakers come back up onto stage. We have a couple of microphones placed at the back for anybody who has anything for them. Can I...
The microphones are in the back if you would like to come ask questions.
Thank you so much.
Do you have any injection molded chairs?
Not at the Smithsonian.
Any questions from the audience?
It's bright light.
Wait, ma'am.
Of all the furniture that has been developed by human beings, why is the chair the least comfortable over the centuries?
Well, as I explained, we're not made to sit in chairs. We were made to stand, or it's not that we were made to sit on the ground. Sitting on the ground doesn't solve the problem. Just sitting is an awkward position for us. We're much better off lying down, which is, of course, why for hundreds of years people ate lying down. I mean, the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans all ate lying down, probably because it's just more comfortable to eat lying down. I've never done it, so I don't know. But I think that's the easiest answer to your question.
Yes, there are designers who are producing. It's a very good question. There are designers who are making expensive objects, maybe not for the 1%, but for the upper echelons. I mean, ultimately, makers have to find something that suits their temperament and their practice, and which is viable. I mean, ultimately, we're talking about labor. You know, I always am impressed with dismay when I go into ateliers of makers, and they'll tell a lamenting story that people will like their work but then be disgusted or upset by the price. And I offer this because I think that what commodity culture has done and what mass production has done is it's devalued labor. And there are so many makers here who spend hours and hours and hours using their skills to produce objects that should have a right price on it. But the public, the broad public, used to cheap bargains and things made in China and plastic extruded chairs don't necessarily want to acknowledge that the price of human labor is not cheap. psychically or economically. So to your question about a 1%, yes, there are makers who are producing luxury goods in the United States and in Canada. I sit on the board of Craft Ontario, and thinking about a recent exhibition of objects, there was a chair for $15,000. Hundreds of hours of labor, exquisite material, didn't sell, and people reacted to it that this is very expensive. And it raises the question about, well, what is the relationship between the amount of energy, mental, physical, that goes into the making of something and its value in the world? The 1% may not have to, well, maybe they pinch pennies, I don't know. But I don't think they have to worry so much around the price they would pay for something. Most people, though, I would say in the North American market, have been removed. We produce what we don't consume, and we consume what we don't produce, and this has resulted in a devaluation of the value of labor. It's a very good question. Yes. Good for some people. I hope that the profit-sharing relationship benefits the makers. Well, so 50-50, 60-40. Right, well, I mean, makers do need a venue for the selling of their work. And I guess the question is, what's the fitting venue to the maker's idea of the standing of their work? And so, you know, ateliers and the relationship with, you know, venues like Gill makes sense. So,
is that a good thing? Is that a good thing that they're selling chairs for $100,000? I'm just curious what you're. It's a very good thing for you. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Another point is that carpenters, Paris and London, are also involved in making the work for the people who they represent.
Right.
I mean, they have their own bronze casting foundry. They work with some other shops that made Saussas's furniture.
Yes.
And there's a great sort of cooperation among that. A lot of artists do not make their own work.
No. Well, in thinking about that, I can't help but sort of share my impression of Jeff Koons, you know, who, if you think about the contemporary art market, he is, I think, arguably one of the most successful contemporary makers. He's also very much interested in quality control, and he went to the extent, he was concerned about the metal he was using, the steel he was using in his casting. He bought a decommissioned ore mine in Pennsylvania and opened a foundry, so he smelts his own metal. So that is vertical integration, which takes us back to the 19th century, which then I guess, you know, the idea of having to sort of separate out. So absolutely, these very sophisticated and complicatedly arranged ateliers to make sure that the work that comes out is exactly as the envisioner. I mean, I think Koons is an envisioner. He has 137 paid employees, Jeff Koons. Studio Jobs has 40 people on the payroll. So, thank you for that.
I don't know whether this is a question or a comment, but I feel as though it really is based on the philosophy of the maker. Whether the maker wants to reach a broader audience, and these days, especially with all the new technology, whether or not the maker is employing assistance of machinery or whatever. And, you know, we at the Maloof Foundation, of course, revere Sam and his notion of no chair left his workshop that he didn't begin and have a major part in. So I guess I'm wondering if that philosophy will hold over with the new technology going forward.
That's a very good question. I mean, I think Fordism as the idea of staged making provided us with a very effective industrial model, not without social consequence, not without the consequences around potentially the exploitation of labor. If a maker wants to produce things and requires owning a foundry and having all of these skilled people in the assembly, well, the process from thinking to realization, so be it. The point I was trying to make is that whereas in the world of kingship, there was a patronage relationship where objects were produced in the service of the state. Today, objects are being made in the service of capitalism. And the self-fashioning, we all buy things and we wear clothes because we want to communicate who we think we are. This 1% or 2% or 3% are doing the same things by buying the 100th floor penthouse and filling it perhaps with luxury objects. I haven't had the privilege of going to those apartments, but I think that's the gesture. So if a maker wants to have a practice defined by certain complexities, so be it. Economics at this point in time are complex. Manufacturing is complex. I think a lot of makers hold on, I think within the realm of craft thinking, to a type of romantic notion of labor and the idea that Mr. Maloof, one object that had to meet his standards before it would leave his studio. That is fine. It's no better than the studio jobs model. It's just a different model. Because ultimately the things are getting made, whether by Maloof or others, are products.
I think, too, that, as you say, it's a modern idea, this idea of the maker, because in the 18th century, and those chairs are arguably at least as sophisticated, and I would say more so than most modern chairs, it's very hard to figure out, for instance, who designed the chair, because at least a dozen people are involved in making a chair. In the upholsterer, they had separate guilds, so the upholsterer is separate from the framer, and only the framer in France signed the chair. And that was simply a rule of his guild. But that didn't mean that the framer designed the chair. Sometimes the upholsterer designed the chair, sometimes the decorator or the architect designed the chair, sometimes the sort of the businessman, I can't remember the name now, who essentially he had a shop. He was the man who connected with the clients. You get the feeling that in many cases that person may have designed the chair. So the idea of design is very difficult to pin down at that point, and yet they're making totally crafted and totally beautiful chairs.
This will be our final question.
So with the duality that exists now with the makers of 1%, hi, I'm over here. With the makers of the 1% chairs or the 2%, kind of in conjunction on the other end with the makers doing that pottery disguised as helping out a community. In our future, do you see kind of a melding of these two very extreme types of craft kind of coming together?
Could I beg you to just...
No, I think that they're completely counter, and I think that there's a value system that is ascribed to both. And when I asked, is it a problem that something is sold for $100,000, I'm happy to buy something for $100,000 if someone wants to buy that. But there's a value system in it, and I think that we're in a very peculiar moment of incredible elitism where a tremendous amount of art making and high craft has essentially become luxury goods, which I think is what your talk pointed out. And I think the question is, what does that mean? What are the implications of it? What's the history of that? I don't think there can be a conflation, although if we had longer, we could talk about the way in which perhaps Theaster Gates would be a model of the conflation, in that he's very savvy in the ability to make objects that are sold in a highly elite sphere with the funds going back into a community-based project. And he talks about it racially. He says, I'm a black man playing the white man's game and I'm going to win. So, and I think we can't also take race and access and equity out of these questions. I think they're highly charged questions and they're highly complicated ones. And I'm not looking to turn Haystack into the Haystack Mountain School of Social Practice, but I am looking to a generation that I believe is saying, this isn't going to happen for us in this way. The bubble's popping, or the bubble's not going to pop, but we don't believe in the ethics of it, or we do believe in the ethics and I want to make a ton of money. Right, so I think there's multiple ways, but I think if they're going to coalesce, they're going to coalesce in a really messy way, in perhaps the way that the Astor's work might be done. And again, I don't think one is bad. I don't think it's bad to sell an object for $100,000, but it's complicated. Nor do I think that the Warren Mackenzie model of pottery, of leaving a cigar box out and your pots, and selling them and hoping people will put in what they feel is worthwhile, that works in some places, but what Warren Mackenzie found was people were coming to his studio, leaving him a small amount of money and then reselling it on the secondary market. That was smart, right? I mean, who was foolish there? So, it's complicated, and I'm so grateful that this symposium started out with questions about value. But, so that's maybe my long-winded answer.
It's not just super luxury crafts that are, I go to the Smithsonian craft fair, it's fabulous. I absolutely understand that when things are priced there, like a basket, from North Carolina, right, is $600. And I understand that because of the amount of work that it took to do it. But it's not just luxury crafts that are out of reach of most people. It's the $100,000 ones. It's the $600 ones. It's the, I go to that crafts fair and treat it almost as a museum, and I'm happy if I can find something. So I mean, the whole issue of you think of crafts and making things with your hands, basically started out very utilitarian. And now, there's hundreds of craft fairs out in the country, and I understand the pricing, but it's still out of reach of most people to buy.
And I think that's a good point that we can all continue to discuss at lunch. We're going to take our break now. We'll reconvene at 2 o'clock. There's a lot of restaurants in the area. If you're unfamiliar, there are lists at the information table right outside, so please grab one and come back at 2 o'clock, and we'll see you then. Thank you all. Thank you, gentlemen. I try very hard.
You're very